A pony stuck a Hi, Founder fans. Jason here. Welcome to Founder of the Day, a read-along. Today we are discussing Federalist number 5, of course, written by John Jay. I will say right off the bat, what do you think of my interesting, silly intro music? I am always trying to improve this channel. That helped me learn about putting in a theme song at the beginning, though I assure you it will not remain that way. Anyway, Federalist number 5 is the last Federalist paper we get from John Jay for quite a while. I'm going to actually pop up right over to the big screen here. Federalist number 5, the same subject continued, concerning dangers from foreign force and influence, for the Independent Journal on November 10th, 1787, of course written by John Jay. Jay would not write another paper after this all the way till the following March. About 4 months go by. He falls ill, at least that's what historians tell us, although the exact illness I am still unclear on. He leaves the rest of the heavy lifting to James Madison and Alexander Hamilton. Now, in the previous few papers, John Jay has outlined why the Constitution will help protect the United States from foreign force and influence, aka any wars started for any reason by foreign nations. He spends most of Federalist number 3 discussing why they might go to war for real causes. Federalist number 4 discusses pretend causes, and as he alludes to, this one will most likely try and discuss why internal insurrections are no good. I do want to note that I have not read these in quite some time. I have read and reviewed them for founderoftheday.com. There is also a link in the description below if you are interested in reading along. Here we go. Let's look. Now, as always, it is addressed to the people of the state of New York. I am going to make a quick adjustment to get everything on the screen there for you. There we go. All right. Now, after addressing to the people of the state of New York, we are going one sentence at a time. So, starts off with a little bit of history lesson, as the founders like to do. Queen Anne, in her letter of the 1st of July, 1706, to the Scotch Parliament, makes some observations on the importance of the union then forming between England and Scotland, which merit our attention. Not much to discuss there. Queen Anne, he's going to say, hey, look, Great Britain promoted how important union was, and let's learn from it. I shall present the public with one or two extracts from it. Quote, an entire and perfect union will be the solid foundation of lasting peace. It will secure your religion, liberty, and property, remove the animosities amongst yourselves, and the jealousies and differences betwixt our two kingdoms. She continues, it must increase your strength, riches, and trade, and by this union the whole island being joined in an affection and free from all apprehensions of different interests, will be enabled to resist all its enemies. And of course, like John Jay likes to say, will resist its enemies. These quotes that he's taken from Queen Anne are much of common law of the United States came from Great Britain, and much of the Constitution was based off of the British system of government. So he's using this to verify that, hey, look, like the Queen Anne said to Scotland, if we unite, we'll be powerful, we'll be protected, and our liberties will be secure. And I'm assuming he will go on to elaborate from there. It's a little bit of a lengthy sentence, but we'll do it. Another quote from Queen Anne. We most earnestly recommend to your calmness and unanimity that in this great and weighty affair, that the union may be brought to a happy conclusion, being the only effectual way to secure our present and future happiness, and disappoint the designs of our and your enemies, who will doubtless on this occasion use their utmost endeavors to prevent or delay this union. So, John Jay is using the example of Queen Anne telling Scotland how great it will be if they join England in union under Great Britain banner. Well, he's going to use this to demonstrate why it is so important that the United States follow suit. All right. It was remarked in the preceding paper that weakness and divisions at home would invite dangers from abroad, and that nothing would tend more to secure us from them than union, strength, and good government within ourselves. This subject is copious and cannot easily be exhausted. So by the preceding paper, he means Federalist number 4. He says, I proved that being divided at home will lead to invasions and war from other nations who have no respect from us. That's why we need the Union, which would provide strength and good government. The subject is copious and cannot easily be exhausted. So I could go on forever about this. Let's see. The history of Great Britain is the one with which we are in general the best acquainted, and it gives us many useful lessons. Absolutely right. Of course, being former subject to Great Britain, they know more about Great Britain than anyone else, just being a member of that nation, that empire. And as said before, much of the American system in common law and the Constitution is based off that of Great Britain. So Great Britain, studying the history of it, will be good to give us a starting point to learn why the Constitution is necessary. We may profit by their experience without paying the price which it cost them. That's a fun line. We'll learn from what they did, and we don't have to suffer the consequences like they did. Although it seems obvious to common sense that the people of such an island should be but one nation, yet we find that they were for ages divided into three, and that those three were almost constantly embroiled in quarrels and wars with one another. Now, we said Scotland and England, but the third would be Wales. And yes, they were very much fighting amongst each other on that one island for quite a while. Let's see. Notwithstanding, their true interest with respect to the continental nation was really the same. Yet, by the arts and policy and practices of those nations, their mutual jealousies were perpetually kept inflamed, and for long series of years they were far more inconvenient and troublesome than they were useful and assisting to each other, who essentially, even though they were on the same island and they were more closely related to each other than the people in continental Europe, well, as he says, jealousies, mutual interests. People who wanted to hold on to their little bit of power would not rescind a greater power for the benefit of the whole. Okay. Should the people of America divide themselves into 3 or 4 nations? Okay, let me say that again. Should the people of America divide themselves into 3 or 4 nations, would not the same thing happen? Not much to say there. Just, if we weren't one nation, wouldn't we be fighting for mutual jealousies when we work better together? Would not similar jealousies arise and be in like manner cherished? So, not saying much more there. But what happens when you go one sentence at a time? Some of the sentences are very not as impactful as others. Instead of there being, quote, joined affection and free from all apprehensions of different, quote, interests, envy and jealousy would soon extinguish confidence and affection, and the partial interest of each confederacy, instead of the general interest of all America, would be the only sub-objects of their policy and pursuit. I do want to note, he has referenced several times 3 or 4 confederacies. If this is the first time you're watching one of these read-alongs, instead of 13 separate nations, what Jake assumes will happen, and what was discussed at the time, is that the separate states, had they not all fallen in line under the Constitution, would have formed different either nations or confederacies. Generally 3, New England, Mid-Atlantic, South, would have expected to be separate nations, but they would have united together in some fashion, was the presumption of the time. So when he's saying this, these 3 or 4 separate confederacies, they wouldn't they just fall into, like he says, jealousies and envy? Oh, you think you have a powerful mid-Atlantic navy? Well, look at our southern navy, and things of that nature. Hence, like most other bordering nations, they would always be involved in disputes and war, or live in the constant apprehension of them. So, again, he's the one who emphasized bordering, not me. The reason this is important is, as he was saying, in England, these bordering nations of Scotland, England, and Wales were always at war with each other for petty envies, as John Jay saw them, as opposed to realizing that they had a lot more in common with each other than they did with anyone else in the world, especially people whose lands were not bordered. And of course, whether they be 13 separate nations or a few confederacies in the United States, they would be bordering each other, and that would lead to some trouble, according to Mr. J here. Let's see. The most sanguine... I never know how to pronounce this word. Is it sanguine or sanguine? I think it's sanguine. The most sanguine advocates for 3 or 4 confederacies cannot reasonably suppose that they would long remain exactly on an equal footing in point of strength, even if it was possible to form them so at first. But, admitting that to be practicable, yet what human contrivance can secure the countenance of such equality? And while it's easy for me to say that, what he's saying here is we could start off with equal powers in our navies and our armies, but that's not going to last. Someone's going to invest more in their navy than they are in the army. Some will invest more in the army. Some will invest more in manufacturers and won't pay enough attention to their navy. And there will be divisions and differences, which will lead to jealousies and envies. Independent of those local circumstances which tend to beget an increased power in one part and to impede its progress in another, we must advert to the effects of that superior policy in good management which would probably distinguish the government of one above the rest, and by which their relative equality in strength and consideration would be destroyed. So, independent of those local circumstances which tend to beget an increased power. Basically he's saying we can't find ourselves in a situation where it's natural for these things to happen, for people to get a little bit more power over here than they have over there. We must advert to the effects of superior policy and good management. So we need to, instead of having power plays all the time, need to try and make things a little more equal for all intents and purposes. For it cannot be presumed that the same degree of sound policy, prudence, and foresight would uniformly be observed by each of these confederacies for a long succession of years. So, the sound, I can't get it out. Basically, Jay is saying we can't just assume that we're going to have good government the whole time. Eventually, something's going to go wrong. I bet I know what his answer is. The Constitution? Let's see. Whenever and from whatever causes it might happen, and happen it would, that any one of these nations or confederacies should rise on the scale of political importance much above the degree of her neighbors, that moment would those neighbors behold her with envy and fear. So what he's saying is, and he says, and happen it would, so he predicts eventually one of these separate nations that arise without the Constitution, one of them will become more powerful than the others. It will garner more respect on the international stage than the others, and the others will be upset and jealous and afraid of that nation that has arisen right next to them. Let's see. Both those passions would lead them to countenance, if not to promote, whatever might promise to diminish her importance. It would also restrain them from measures calculated to advance or to even to secure her prosperity. So they will find ways to slow down the power of their neighbors in an effort to keep themselves on an equal footing, whether natural or not. They would also, essentially, and it would destroy the more prosperous nation's prosperity. Much time would not be necessary to enable her to discern these unfriendly dispositions. So the more powerful nation that's arising will quickly realize the neighbors are trying to hold her back. She would soon begin not only to lose confidence in her neighbors, but also to feel a disposition equally unfavorable to them. So the neighbors get jealous and they are now unhappy of your power, and the powerful nation will realize this and will now start to distrust them and say they're just out to get me, and it will also make them angry at that particular neighbor or those neighbors. Distrust naturally creates distrust, and by nothing is goodwill and kind conduct more speedily changed than by individual jealousies and uncandid imputations, whether expressed or implied. So, if the little nations distrust the big neighbors, naturally the big neighbor is going to distrust the little neighbor. And even if the neighbor isn't outright saying, hey, we don't trust you, we could tell by the look on your face that you are not particularly happy right now. The North is generally the region of strength, and many local circumstances render it probable that the most northern of the proposed confederacies would, at a period not very far distant, be unquestionably more formidable than any of the others. So this is a fascinating look at things, because at the time, Virginia was obviously the most powerful powerful state in the Union, with South Carolina pretty high on the list. Pennsylvania, probably a clear-cut number 2. He's writing from New York to the people of New York, and New York was rising. Now, when he says the North, you would generally think New England, but New York was more mid-Atlantic, although if we're being honest, New York was kind of its own ballgame. And when he says 3 or 4 confederacies, the 4th one would probably be some coalition of New Jersey and New York, I would imagine, because they are a little bit different than Pennsylvania. New Jersey and Pennsylvania had a lot in common, but not quite as much as New York and New Jersey, which had about 100 years earlier been governed by one government for a brief time. So I am fascinated to see him say the North would become the most powerful. He's probably including New York in that. Or maybe he's trying to scare New Yorkers to think New England's going to be the more powerful. Again, as always, this is a propaganda piece trying to persuade the general public of a certain method of political thought. That being said, this is literally the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. It's unfolding as the Constitution is being written. The transition from Enlightenment to Industrial Revolution is happening as Jay writes this, which is an important thing to remember, because it is New England that many of the early factories would arise, and it would become very powerful, at least financially. All right. No sooner would this become evident than the Northern hive would excite the same ideas and sensations in the more southern parts of America, which it formerly did in the southern parts of Europe. So the South is going to see this and get a little nervous about what's going on up north with all their power accumulation. As I said, especially when Virginia and South Carolina were so powerful in the first place. Nor does it appear to be a rash conjecture that it is young swarms might excuse me. Nope. So what happens when you go live. Try that again. Nor does it appear to be a rash conjecture that its young swarms might be often, and now I can't get it out. Last time. Nor does it appear to be a rash conjecture that its young swarms might often be tempted to gather honey in the more blooming fields and milder air of their luxurious and more delicate neighbors. So, what he's basically saying here, young bees like to gather honey in the nicer fields and luxurious air. It's a nice little metaphor there for saying young people in the South might leave their homes to go to the North, where they have more opportunity and there's more wealth and advancement and power. Not necessarily unlike what's happening. Again, I don't like to talk about modern politics, but we do kind of we can reference a lot of the people leaving the countryside in America today and heading for a few cities on the coast, because that's where the jobs are and that's where opportunity lies. Though, according to John Jay, I'm assuming he's saying this wouldn't happen. All right, pretty long sentence here. We'll break it down. They who well consider the history of similar divisions and confederacies will find abundant reason to apprehend that those in contemplation would in no other sense be neighbors than they would be borderers. So, if we look at history, at other times divisions of this nature have happened, we will notice that some of the young people do flee to their neighbors. Is this one run-on sentence? Yeah, okay. That they would neither love nor trust one another. Let me just go back to this last sentence real quick. I read through it a little bit briefly. Confederates will find abundant reason. Oh, okay. He's going back to the original point that these separate nations, if they're not one nation under the Constitution, these separate nations will obviously distrust one another, and that they would neither love nor trust one another, but on the contrary would be a prey to discord, jealousy, and mutual injuries. In short, that they would place us exactly in the situations which some nations doubtlessly wish to see, viz., formidable only to each other. So what John Jay is saying here, and again, those are his highlights at the bottom, not mine. if we don't unite under one constitution, we are going to have these jealousies that he was talking about before. We're going to get angry at each other for a variety of reasons, and every other nation in the world will be happy to see we are only powerful enough to hurt each other, not powerful enough to hurt them, only being divided, not really achieving any kind of international prominence. All right, a little bit of a long sentence. From these considerations, it appears that those gentlemen who are greatly mistaken, who suppose that alliances offensive and defensive might be formed between these confederacies, and would produce that combination and union of will, of arms, and of resources, which would be necessary to put and keep them in a formidable state of defense against foreign enemies. So what he's saying is, I think I've proven my point, that if we don't unite under the Constitution, people today might be saying that separate nations could form alliances and make sure we can defend ourselves from foreign invasion, but these jealousies and envies and fears that will arise between different confederacies will eventually lead to us not being able to defend ourselves. Okay, it's another super long one. All right, pretty long. Let's get through it. When the independent states into which Britain and Spain were formerly divided combine in such alliance or unite in their forces against a foreign enemy. Okay, let me, this is one sentence. Let's do this again. Sorry, guys. As I said, haven't really pre-read, trying to react with you. When the independent states into which Britain and Spain were formerly divided combine all such alliance or unite their forces against a foreign enemy. When did the independents... Oh, okay, he's being sarcastic with this sentence. This is a particularly hard sentence to read. When did the independent states... So he's saying like, oh yeah, when did this happen? That Britain and Spain divided and then became allies against a foreign enemy. So he's like basically saying, when did England, Wales, and Scotland divide each other and then unite as separate nations to fight another enemy? Sarcasm is hard to read in 18th century talk. The proposed confederacies will be distinct nations. Yes. Each of them would have its commerce with foreigners to regulate by distinct treaties, and as their productions and commodities are different and proper for different markets, so would those treaties be essentially different. So this one's a little hard to pick apart. What he's saying here is each different section of the United States will be producing something different to sell on the world market. Probably agriculture in the South, as we will come to see, factory type things in the North. So when they're trading internationally, they will need and desire different things in international trade. Therefore, they will make different treaties, and the treaties will need different things. John Jay will, of course, go on to say that the federal government will take all these things into account, when you might hear some anti-federalists arguing, well, yeah, we need different things and we should look out for number one. Different commercial concerns must create different interests, and of course, different degrees of political attachment to and connection with different foreign nations. So piggybacking off of what he just said, we're going to want different things, so let's have different things. Or no. We're going to want different things, so we need the Constitution to make sure we don't have different things. Hence, it might, and probably would, happen that the foreign nation with whom the Southern Confederacy might be at war with the one with whom the Northern Confederacy would be the most desirous of preserving peace and friendship. So, if the South is angry at someone and wants to go to war, the North isn't going to join them because they want to preserve peace and friendship. It's kind of foreshadowing the War of 1812 to a degree. Hopefully I'm not having too much trouble. It's saying I'm having a little trouble. Hopefully everything's fine. But yeah, as I was saying, the War of 1812, you have the Hartford Convention. They almost decide to cede from the Union in the North. Because, I mean, I guess not almost, it's floated. For just this reason. Because the North was very upset that the South was making decisions that benefit the South, but not taking into consideration the needs of the Northern states. An alliance so contrary to our immediate interests would not therefore be easy to form, nor, if formed, would it be observed and fulfilled with perfect good faith. So, even if they did make an alliance, the North with the South, when the South is at war with someone the North wants to agree with, the North might support it in name, but not as well as they could. Okay. Nay, it is far more probable that in America, as in Europe, neighboring nations acting under the impulses of opposite interests and unfriendly passions would frequently be found taking different sides. So yes, we're neighbors, but we're always on different sides because we have different desires and different people are going to help what we want. Considering our distance from Europe, it would be more natural for these confederacies to apprehend danger from one another than from distant nations, and therefore that each of them should be more desirous to guard against the others by the aid of foreign alliances than to guard against foreign dangers by alliances between themselves. So, as he's saying, since America is so far away from Europe, we're probably going to have more troubles with the people right here we're neighbors with than people all the way in Europe. So we should unite together to prevent ourselves from going to war, and therefore be prepared in case Europe comes a-warring. Okay. And here, let us not forget how much more easy it is to receive foreign fleets into our ports and foreign armies into our country than it is to persuade or compel them to depart. That's a fun little sentence. Let us not forget how easy it is for boats to just show up on our shores and how difficult it is for us to get rid of them boats and any navies that might come along with them. How many conquests did the Romans and others make in the characters of their allies, and what innovations did they under the same character introduce the governments of those whom they pretended to protect? So, basically what he's saying here, a little bit of more of a history lesson. The Romans would just go invade their neighbors and say, hey, we're your friends. Here we are, coming to invade you, super friendly, and here's a new government for you. You're welcome. And here he concludes, let candid men judge, then, whether the division of America into any given number of independent sovereignties would tend to secure us against the hostilities and improper influence of foreign nations. So, we'll leave it up to you if dividing into separate nations would really be what's best. It's interesting in this particular paper, reflecting on it immediately, Publius, reflecting on it immediately afterwards, he doesn't talk a lot about why the Constitution would help this solution. He basically just outlines what's wrong with dividing into separate nations. Why, without uniting, we are inviting dangers upon ourselves, we are inviting envies and jealousies to lead war between ourselves instead of focusing on uniting to protect ourselves from afar. It's interesting, as I said at the beginning, I expected him to talk about the insurrections that he was alluding to earlier. I know they do get into that eventually because domestic insurrection was a very particular reason that they started this. Not just because Shays' Rebellion and the fear that drove into the hearts of many people, but because they were afraid a nation or two might separate and then lead to war. So while he does allude to it in this particular paper, he doesn't outright say it. And that's essentially it. That is Federalist number 5th. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5th. And if you have any questions, I'm here to answer them. Feel free to contact me at any of the things in the link below, the social medias, the emails, and such. I will be here. We are going tomorrow at 8:15 to get into number 6 and later in the week number 7. Looking forward to that. I think it's Allie Hams comes up next, aka Alexander Hamilton, if that's what you want to call him. Allie Hams a lot is what I usually go with. Thank you so much for reading. I'll put myself up big right here. Thank you for reading. I hope you liked my thing at the beginning, my little test run of a theme song. It doesn't sound great. I don't look great, but that's okay because we're leaving now anyway. Thank you for watching. I will be back with another Founder in the morning, and I will be back with another Federalist review this tomorrow. And I don't have a sign off for this yet. So see ya. See you tomorrow.